Johnson. I'm a retired professor of history here at Notre Dame, and I've a long acquaintance with some of these people on the panel. I think we can look forward to a lively session. The order will be that the two commentators will speak before the author of the book, which is a little bit unusual. So I'm going to say just a word about the book on the assumption that not all of you will have had a chance to read it in full. The Catholicism and American Freedom is a history of American Catholic life, but it isn't a history of American Catholicism as such. Rather, it's a very tightly focused intellectual history that goes very quickly past a number of the social and institutional dimensions. Tightly focused intellectual history concentrating on the interplay between Catholic and American ideas of freedom. McGreevy's strategy is to select issues on which these differing ideas came into play at various times since the middle of the 19th century, and then to deploy a really fabulous array of evidence illustrating the two sides of this interplay. The issues that he selects are education, which comes up several times, slavery and abolition, the Civil War, the new organic nationalism in the United States after the Civil War, aspects of socioeconomic reform from the late 19th into the early decades of the 20th century, the critique of Catholic authoritarianism in the second quarter of the 20th century, and the development of various issues related to human life, mainly birth control and abortion, since the 1930s. He shows that on these issues there was a basic clash of fundamental outlooks, worldviews, ethos sets. With Catholics stressing social order, communal solidarity, and hierarchical authority, while the mainstream American outlook prizes individual freedom and personal autonomy above everything else. The intensity of these things varies from time to time, and we'll hear about that. Striking in this book, and it's really outstanding and new in the degree to which Professor McGreevy sets American, both Catholic and general American, developments in these areas in the context of European and Western culture-wide influences. And also another, well, I have a lot more I could say about this book, but I think it will, the viewpoints will come out in the remarks of our two commentators and in Professor McGreevy's discussion. We're going to try to leave a lot of time for questions from the floor. The order of presentation is first we will hear from Father Michael Baxter, CSC, a member of the Congregation of Holy Cross, got his Master of Divinity here in the early 1980s, did various kinds of pastoral work, including co-founding a house of hospitality in Phoenix, Arizona, before going off to Duke for doctoral studies. He's been a member of the Department of Theology here at Notre Dame since 1996. The second person, these remarks are to be pretty brief, 10 to 12 minutes. The second speaker is Professor Alasdair MacIntyre, who needs very little said by way of introduction, one of the outstanding internationally respected philosophers of our time, who has been here at Notre Dame, I don't know how long, quite a while now. The author of After Virtue and many other well-respected and widely discussed books. So we'll have first remarks from a philosopher, pardon me, I got it backwards, remarks from a theologian, and then from a philosopher, and then the historian, who, Professor McGreevy, now chairman of the department here at Notre Dame, who joined the faculty, I think, in 1993, 92? 97. I retired in 96. He was an undergraduate here and he got his degree at Stanford in 1992. That's where I went off. And has published a number of very significant and widely noted articles, and before this book, another called Parish Boundaries, dealing with the confrontation and interaction between urban Catholics and African Americans in northern cities in the first half of the 20th century. So I turn it over now to Father Baxter.
I'm always glad to clarify a fact with an historian. 1996. I'm also glad to be here to respond to this book. I have some opening remarks which try to characterize the book too, figuring that many of you would not have read it. It's only been published just this year. And after reading it, I understand why several years ago, when my office was on the first floor of DCO and facing the stadium, that why this guy was going back and forth to the library 4 or 5 times a day, armful of books. And I've had the pleasure now of reading the fruits of that work. It's an excellent history. One that is eminently readable, so that one is disappointed that a given chapter is over, or surprised at how much one has read at a single sitting. One that is extremely well researched. The endnotes total to more than 100 pages, and with more than 100 plus notes for each of the 10 chapters. And it is a history that is full of vivid episodes and startling facts. Episodes such as the Eliot School Rebellion of 1859, with which the book starts, where poor 10-year-old Thomas Wall refused to recite the Protestant version of the 10 Commandments at his father's behest, and thereby found himself in the center of a national controversy. This little 10-year-old kid from Boston area. And facts such as the fact that Gerald Kelly, the Jesuit moral theologian, instructed his readers that eating turtle soup violates the ban for not eating meat on Friday when prepared with a beef base, but does not violate it when prepared with an oyster base. So to the great relief of turtle soup connoisseurs, we have that and many other facts besides. These episodes and facts are imploded within a narrative that has 2 focal points. The first being that strange tribe or set of tribes that come under the name Catholic or Catholicism. And the second being that powerful and ever more pervasive set of beliefs and practices that come under the heading of American freedom. The purpose of the narrative is to demonstrate the interaction between these 2 focal points, hence the title, Catholicism and American Freedom. These same 2 focal points shape a long line of general surveys of the history of Catholicism in America. David J. O'Brien's Public Catholicism in 1989, J. Dolan's The American Catholic Experience in 1985, James Hennessy's American Catholics in 1981, Thomas T. McAvoy's A History of the Catholic Church in the United States in 1969, which our moderator helped complete once Father McAvoy died, before he finished the book. And before that, American Catholicism in 1955, and then again in 1969 by John Tracy Ellis, commonly known as the Dean of American Catholic Historians. With such a long line of esteemed predecessors, one might be tempted to think that yet another narrative on this topic would have little new to say. But that would indeed be a mistake, because McGreevy's narrative brings new emphasis to the way in which the political situation and intellectual life of Catholicism in Europe has influenced and shaped the political situation and intellectual life of Catholicism in the United States. The way in which, to be more specific, the Church's condemnation of liberalism in the 19th century as part of its struggle to retain or regain temporal sway over the nation-states of Europe, especially France. This condemnation of liberalism generated an opposition in the United States between anti-Catholic nationalists and Catholic ultramontanes. An opposition that was played out very dramatically and rather fruitlessly when it came to many great issues of the day, such as slavery or education or the social question. Given this opposition, there was little space for the U.S. Catholic liberals in the 19th century to operate. And in many ways, McGreevy tells the story of how such a space opened up as we move into the 20th century. McGreevy's narrative is wonderfully rich in detail, bringing out aspects of people and events that are often neglected or omitted, such as the staunch opposition to birth control by John Ryan, who was often simplistically portrayed as a Catholic progressive or progressive social reformer. But in spite of the unprecedented level and detail and complexity that McGreevy brings into this narrative, it still nevertheless is structured on the same basic plot line as that of his predecessors. Thus, the pivotal events in his narrative, it seems to me, is the embrace by Catholic theologians and social theorists of democracy in the middle of the 20th century, which McGreevy takes up in Chapter 7, entitled Democracy, Religious Freedom, and the Nouvelle Théologie. The key background event here is the onset of totalitarianism in Europe in the mid-20th century. And the key figures here are Jacques Maritain and John Courtney Murray, an unlikely pair, as McGreevy calls them, who faced a two-pronged opposition of, on the one hand, individualist liberalism, such as espoused by Paul Blanchard and many others, and on the other hand, the anti-liberal democratic forces in the Church. In the face of this two-pronged opposition, Maritain and Murray provided a nuanced political theory whereby the Catholic Church could embrace a properly understood and rightly practiced modern liberal democracy. And this narrative is just wonderful in showing how this was not simply the work of these two people, but a whole constellation of scholars who were operating in the mid-20th century, many of whom are right here at the University of Notre Dame, some of which may be in this room. While I think that the efforts of Maritain and Murray were heroic, I am not in favor of a narrative that simply places them, names them as heroes, not because of anything lacking in their scholarship, of course, which is more impressive the more I read it. So much to learn, but because of the overall agenda of providing a Christian theoretical endorsement of modern liberal democracy, which I believe is both self-defeating and dangerous. By way of explanation, I want to turn back to the 19th century setting that McGreevy brings up and offer a possible alternative reading of the European background events and how they play into the U.S. situation. To explain myself here, I want to call attention to the European political struggle that made the United States seem like such a promising place for the Church to grow and flourish. In Europe, it seemed like there was bleak alternatives indeed. Throughout Europe in the 19th century, in one way or another, a struggle was underway between two opposing political forces. The forces of monarchical restoration and the forces associated with reform or revolution. The Church's reflexive response was to side with the forces of restoration on the supposition that it was the only political arrangement that could preserve or restore the religious and moral foundations upon which a genuinely just society rests. Given the virulence with which the Church was persecuted at the French Revolution, this response was understandable, and subsequent events in the 19th century, with one after another nation-state curbing the freedom of the church, evicting it from public life. These events only seem to confirm the church's fear of a secular or lay order. A third alternative to these restorationist or revolutionist alternatives was offered by the French priest Félicité de Lamennais, writing in the middle of the 19th century. Lamennais was no supporter of the revolution, but he was no supporter of a restored monarchy either, which, he argued, had also in a different way curbed the freedom of the church. And he saw in the French Revolution an occasion for the church to extricate herself from the deleterious dynamics of power politics. But his ideas were condemned, so that throughout the 19th century, the church operated with only two alternatives in Europe: Catholic-sponsored monarchical restoration or secular reform and revolution that was ultimately atheist. Looking upon this situation from the outside, Catholics from the United States felt that they had something new to offer. Like liberal Catholics of Europe, they held both the monarchical state and the lay state in disdain, but unlike them, they could point to a third alternative, a state which is neither monarchical nor virulently secular, which neither directly sponsors the practice of religion nor actively prohibits it, which limits itself when it comes to matters of religion except when the free exercise of religion is threatened, in which case it steps in to defend it. The emergence of this state could be regarded by U.S. Catholics as a work of divine providence because it signaled the possibility of a political arrangement in which the church would be free to carry out its mission of bringing the gospel to the nations. Indeed, in this vision, it was expected that America would eventually itself become Catholic, because only Catholicism could satisfy the deep aspirations of freedom that is so dear to all Americans. This line of reasoning can be seen in the writings of Brownson, Hecker. It appears in a subdued form in the documents of the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, and it also appears in the actions and thoughts of American clerics in the late 19th century, such as John Ireland, James Gibbons, John Cain, and others. And while American was condemned by Leo XIII in 1899, these ideas lived on and were developed by Catholic philosophers, political theorists, and historians throughout the first half of the 20th century, as Philip Gleason has shown so vividly in his work Contending with Modernity. Murray fell heir to this vision. He dedicated his life's work to demonstrating that, yes, the political arrangement in the United States provides a genuinely new situation whereby the church's freedom is protected by a limited, religiously neutral, modern state. But as McGreevy shows in his narrative, the vindication of Murray at the Second Vatican Council was followed by a more sobering event of Roe v. Wade, which for Catholics signaled strong alarms. Catholics had made it into the mainstream of America, but is this the place we want to be? This, I think, calls into question, it seems to me, a description of U.S. democracy put forth by Murray and by his many successors. Is the political arrangement of the United States religiously neutral? Can it be? Is the role of the state in American political life as limited as Murray said it must be in order for genuine democracy to flourish? Or does the state behave more like his description of totalitarian democracy? These are not idle questions, as can be seen by reading the political sections of Veritatis Splendor and Evangelium Vitae, the latter of which criticizes the tyrant state, a clear reference to the United States. And they pertain directly to the matter of abortion in the United States, and as well a host of other life issues. I would also suggest the issue of war. McGreevy's account is excellent in pointing out the irony and the struggle of Catholics in the United States in putting forth their vision to the nation in order to effect change regarding these issues, but his narrative seems less cognizant that this agenda of providing an ethic to be embodied in the central institutions of U.S. political and cultural order may simply be impossible. In other words, Murray's agenda, However frustrated, according to McGreevy, it's the right agenda to take up. But here it must be asked whether or not Murray's critics were right when they argued that a doctrinal endorsement of modern liberalism would lead to religious indifferentism among Catholics and a general accommodation to a culture that was more corrosive to the good life than Murray acknowledged. Indeed, my position is too complex to elaborate here, but I can sum it up in this way. That just as the Church in Europe was held captive by the monarchical state in one way, and by the lay state in another way, so the Church in the United States has become captive by the liberal democratic state in yet a third way. In other words, the critical issue is the nature of the modern nation state, which I would contend is not capable of the self-imposed neutrality regarding religion that Catholic proponents of U.S. democracy ascribe to it. Thus, while the liberal democratic state may seem to resolve the problem of monarchy and secular democracy by a new arrangement, Christian democracy, the terms of this solution produce new problems which afford no solution, the new problems centering around the issues of freedom and autonomy. In fact, they may be more insidious because these workings of state hegemony in so-called moderately liberal democracy are more subtle. In stating this, I think I can align myself with Lamennais, who argued that the Church should remove itself from power politics of the modern state system, so as to be truly free to embrace the gospel in a way that it was pursued and embraced before Constantine. This comes right out of Lamennais. And when the Church embraced an imperial agenda. Now, at this point, I could turn to Dorothy Day, who was mentioned once as the best example of a non-state-centered, more evangelical approach to Christian life in the modern world. But Mark and Louise Zwick over here will be speaking on her tomorrow, and I don't want to be perceived as a kind of a Dorothy Day cheerleader either. So let me turn in conclusion to one other related figure, Thomas Merton, who is mentioned in McGreevy's book only once in passing. He was the author, Seven-Story Mountain, one of the greatest religious bestsellers in U.S. history. Two things can be observed about Merton. One, he had a much better grasp of the implications of the Nouvelle Théologie put out by de Lubac and others than Murray, particularly when it came to social change and transformation. He had a richer conception of the interaction between the natural and the supernatural. And he refused to imagine that we could attain natural ends in our political and economic life without the assistance of the supernatural life. A great book in this regard, The Ascent to Truth, whereby Merton shows that Thomas Aquinas was at bottom a mystic, and that John of the Cross was at bottom a Thomist. Got to read the book. He didn't like the book, but it's a great book. It's a call to contemplation as the key to social transformation and spiritual revolution. The second thing I want to notice is this. When we speak of Merton, of course, we imagine that this is the life for someone closed off in the monastery, but Merton himself came to understand that he wanted to open it up, not live in a ghetto. Contemplation was the call of everyone by virtue of their baptism. It was a way to cease being mesmerized by conventional partisan politics and by capitalist culture through personal relationships. Also, it was a way to renew the clergy in the monastery and out. In McGreevy's book, he concludes with a reference to the clergy sexual abuse crisis. I wonder if, in this history, we may look for an avenue forward in these troubled times, which is the note on which the book ends, by looking at someone like Merton and seeing the call to contemplation through darkness into the light of Christ, becoming living flames of love, as our call, all of us. And yet not Merton's monasticism, but something out in the cities, In this sense, we could say that at this point in our history, we are waiting not for Godot nor for another Saint Benedict. We are waiting for another doubtless very different Saint Francis. Thank you.
Three preliminary remarks about John McGreevy's splendid narrative. First, it is a narrative of particular episodes of conflict. And there is one constant feature in those conflicts, and that is oversimplification of large issues on both sides of the conflict, so that one has to ask about each particular issue, what more fundamentally was at stake than the participants themselves perhaps realized. Secondly, these conflicts are conflicts between the American Catholic community and large elements of the non-Catholic American community. It's very easy, I think, for Catholics not to pause and ask how much of the tension and conflict is the kind of tension and conflict that is generated in any culture for Catholics. Catholics can never be quite at home in the world, and this is always going to mean a distancing and a certain measure of division from the world around them. So it's important to ask what here is peculiarly American and what belongs to the situation of Catholics in human culture as such. Partly because of these two features of the episodes that McGreevy narrates, it's also important to understand that in every case, what is called for is the exercise of the virtue of prudence. Prudence in knowing when and how to speak, when to intervene and when not to intervene. And one way of reading McGreevy's history with the virtue of prudence in mind is to ask, when was the virtue of prudence successfully exercised, and when was there a defective understanding of what prudence required from Catholics? To have prudence is to know how to rank order particular goods in particular situations, to know how to recognize the obstacles and sources of frustration in achieving goods, and how to negotiate one's way around and beyond these. And we can identify in McGreevy's narrative at least three areas in which American Catholics still need prudence to know how to do this negotiation. The first area concerns the proper influence of the Church on the state, an issue that's omnipresent in McGreevy's story. From the standpoint of secular America, Catholics are no more than one more interest group whose lobbyists are to be listened to just insofar as failure to listen to them may have economic or political consequences. And insofar as Catholics aspire to be more than this, they appear to many non-Catholics to make claims incompatible with democratic ideals. But to speak as the lobbyists of an interest group speak is not to speak prophetically. It's to abdicate the prophetic role. And to know when to speak prophetically and when to speak as the voice of an interest group is, of course, a matter of the exercise of the virtue of prudence. The second area concerns science and technology. American Catholics have always had to confront charges that in the past the Catholic Church hindered the rise of natural science by imposing restrictions on freedom of scientific inquiry, and that in the present Catholics continue to be on occasion enemies of that freedom, partly because the Catholic ethos is hostile to a pragmatic and skeptical spirit that free inquiry is thought to require, and partly because they attempt to set limits to the use of certain techniques of inquiry, as now in the case of stem cell research. And here again, the issue for Catholics is in part one of prudence. And the question that arises from the perspective afforded by that virtue is whether, in fact, in the case of advancing technology, the Church may not have been insufficiently, rather than excessively, condemnatory. Almost all Catholics, like almost all other Americans, have been uncritical adulators of technologically based innovation. They've not, for example, exhibited any notable concern, way Catholics, that over the past decade, television news programs are being composed of shorter and shorter sound bites to match the lessening attention span and comprehension of their audiences. And interesting when we suppose that higher education is flourishing. They've apparently not been disturbed by those technological transformations of politics that have steadily increased the importance of presentation and public relations as compared with that of content. So part of the importance of McGreevy's narrative is what's not there, what's missing from it. All those issues about which Catholics should have been concerned in such a way as to provoke antagonism and have failed to do so. The fact is that in some respects, the relative lack of anti-Catholic feeling and agitation in the present-day United States is a mark of the Church's failure. And where antagonism has been generated, it's sometimes a mark of the Church's success. Consider in this light a third area of conflict. Summarizing developments from the 1950s to the present, McGreevy says of, quote, the Catholic understanding of the human person, that it clashed with this new liberal emphasis on autonomy. That is, with the claim that which moral principles individuals adopt should be, so far as possible, up to each individual, and the respect for individual preferences should never be violated, except for those minimal sanctions necessary to ensure the rule of law. Sometimes, as McGreevy notes, this claim is expressed in a vocabulary of rights. But what he fails to note adequately is that whether or not it's so expressed, it is, in some respects, an incoherent claim. For the question at once arises, is the decision as to whether or not I am to be bound by this principle up to me? If the answer is yes, then I'm free to adopt a principle that allows me to violate the autonomy of others. If the answer is no, then my autonomy is limited and constrained by at least one principle whose authority is independent of my choices and preferences. There's no way to escape from this dilemma except by reconsidering the claim to autonomy, so that it is derived from some principle or set of principles for which objective authority is claimed. And the principles that are in fact invoked at this point involve a dogmatic conception of rights that belong to individuals qua individuals, of rights that all individuals should enjoy, both as American citizens and as human beings. I suggested at the outset that one thing to be learned from McGreevy's account of past conflicts is the extent to which focus on particular issues has been such as to obscure differences in the general and fundamental beliefs in which those conflicts are rooted. One such set of general and fundamental beliefs is the secular individualism that I've just sketched. And opposed to it is another set of such beliefs, at whose core is a concept notably absent from almost all the debates that McGreevy recounts, the concept of the common good, a good not reducible to, a good that's more and other than, the goods of individuals. That concept of a common good is integral to any Catholic conception of law and rights. It's because of what Catholics take the common good of family life to be that they take the view of sexuality that they do. It's because of what Catholics take the common good of political life to be that they take the view of the Church's legitimate place in politics that they do. It's because of what Catholics take to be the common good of those who engage in the life of the mind that they view scientific inquiry in the way that they do. Abstract these conceptions of common goods from the debates, and at once, without this background, Catholic positions are bound to appear as a set of arbitrary prohibitions and interventions, as they so often do to non-Catholics. It's important, of course, to note that on a Catholic view, a common good is not something achieved at the expense of the goods of individuals. It's rather that each individual is able to achieve her or his own particular good only in and through those social relationships which can be sustained only by directing ourselves towards the achievement of common goods. By contrast, on the view of rights presupposed and embodied, both in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, rights belong exclusively to individuals, and the protection of rights is necessary in order to permit each adult individual to pursue her or his own good as she or he sees fit. Now, I believe it is this contrast that generates particular conflicts in particular areas, that the hostility to Catholic pronouncements on public affairs designed to influence public policy, the hostility to Catholic attitudes towards the natural sciences and technology, the hostility to Catholic judgments that individual autonomy is acceptable only if accompanied by a recognition that, for example, the taking of innocent life, including innocent fetal life, is unconditionally prohibited, whatever the Constitution says, whatever federal and state laws say, and whatever individual choices may be, the hostility to all these Catholic views springs from one and the same fear that principles to which individuals have not given their assent should be imposed on their choices and actions. And if in these three debates, American Catholics were to urge on their fellow Americans considerations concerning the common good, as understood, for example, by Aquinas, the reply would be that such considerations have force only so far as they are subordinated to and redefined in terms of the overriding claims of individual rights. Now, at this point in the argument, it may seem that I'm interpreting the debates that McGreevy recounts as if the American conception of freedom on the one hand and the Catholic conception of common goods on the other are starkly incompatible. Yet if we suppose this to be the case, we need to turn to another part of McGreevy's narrative, that which concerns the project engaged in by Maritain and Yves Simon and by John Courtney Murray, in very different ways, the project of reconciling Catholicism and American democracy. Is the incompatibility between the two such that this project had to be founded on nothing but illusion? Not at all, and this for more than one reason. First, there are other strands in American thought over and above the rights-based individualism that I sketched, including traditions of mutual aid, of neighborliness, that give a certain priority to shared and common goods. Secondly, as Maritain noted, and McGreevy quotes him, the 18th century and American consciousness of the rights of the person really has its origin in the conception of man and natural law established by centuries of Christian philosophy. And one consequence of this historical relationship is that there's some common ground, at least, on questions of rights, a common ground that can be the starting point for constructive debate rather than barren controversy. What Maritain, Simon, and John Courtney Murray succeeded in showing, and it wasn't quite the same as what they had intended to show, was that Catholic Americans could be loyal and involved members of the American polity, provided that this polity is understood as one in which every issue that divides Catholics from other Americans is itself open to democratic debate. But if the polity is thus understood, it becomes, as I suggested earlier, a place of continuing tension and never wholly resolved ambiguities. For many claims on both sides about rights and goods become to some degree contestable, and all conclusions about rights and goods provisional and open to further revision and reformation. So to give one's allegiance to the American polity thus understood is to commit oneself to participation in a continuing argument in which the spokespersons for American individualism and those for Catholic conceptions of human nature, human good, and common good confront one another both as antagonists and as partners in conversation. The history of both is a history of the interest of both is in continuing a conversation and a set of negotiated, never final arrangements. So we need to write the history as a history of a continuing conversation. And McGreevy's history is the starting point for doing so. But perhaps only the starting point, for we need to go beyond his history, first of all to evaluate the background beliefs of the contending parties, partly to evaluate the utterances and actions of those contending parties in the light afforded by the virtue of prudence. It's no criticism of McGreevy that he didn't write this further kind of history, and this for two reasons. First, if McGreevy and a number of others hadn't written as they've done, we would be in no position even to think about this further kind of inquiry. And secondly, the kind of evaluative history I'm talking about, one that writes history in the light afforded by a conception of the virtues, of rights and of goods, a philosophical history, and it's a kind of history that has been written by Catholics, notably by Christopher Dawson. This, however, is just the kind of history whose authors would never get any tenure in any American history department.
Let me thank my colleagues, Bill Gleason, whose work has been inspirational for so many, including myself, in the field of U.S. religious and intellectual history. Father Michael Baxter, my friend, colleague, and occasional tennis partner. from whom I have learned much of importance beyond the need for a reliable backhand. And Alasdair MacIntyre, quite simply one of the most important figures in the intellectual life of our own time, who honors all of us in this room and at Notre Dame by his presence. I'll make my response brief, since the most stimulating components of these sessions, I think, are exchanges between panelists and exchanges between panelists and the audience. First, in just a few words, let me say what I hope to accomplish in Catholicism and American Freedom, a book that all of you should buy, and perhaps that a few of you at least should read. My goal was simple: to sketch the interplay between Catholic and American ideas of freedom and how that shaped 19th century debates over education, slavery, and nationalism, and 20th century debates over the economy, education again, social welfare policy, democracy, birth control, and abortion. I asked and tried to answer various questions. Why did so few Catholics urge the abolition of slavery, and why were there so many abolitionists who were anti-Catholic? Why did anti-Catholicism powerfully shape American, but not just American, French, British, German, Mexican, and Chilean nationalism in the late 19th century North Atlantic world? How did Catholic ideas of the economy coalesce with those of the Democratic Party in the 1930s? And how did Catholic ideas about human sexuality and human life split apart from that party in the late 1960s? The trick, I thought, was to capture two traditions in motion, not one. To explore American ideas about Catholicism along with the predispositions, at times blinders, framing the mental landscape of American Catholics. I envisioned two audiences. First, I wanted historians of the United States to recognize what historians of Europe and Latin America already know: that Catholicism, along with liberalism and socialism, is one of the three great social and political traditions to emerge from the 19th century. In this country, Catholics were the single largest religious group as early as 1850. And Catholicism and anti-Catholicism powerfully shaped understandings of events as diverse as the Fugitive Slave Law and Roe v. Wade. More broadly, I saw the book as a moment of reflection for Catholics themselves. Here I include myself, a graduate of St. Mary's Grade School in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the diocesan high school of that same city, and then Notre Dame. This life experience and that of my family gave the much misused term ghetto a good name. But I wondered what ideas sustained this ghetto, and what ideas prevented its further development. I wanted Catholics to gain a sharper sense of what the American experience has meant for what is, after all, a Roman Catholic Church, and what that same church has meant for the United States. Now, let me briefly make a few impromptu remarks, because I hadn't seen them before today, or hadn't heard them before today, to Father Baxter's generous and thoughtful comments. Where we agree. I agree with Michael that the pivotal event, in retrospect, in the book is the Catholic embrace of democracy in the mid-20th century. Where we disagree. I disagree with Michael in his argument that the Christian endorsement of liberal democracy, beginning in the 19th century and culminating, I think, in the mid-20th century, was dangerous. I think it was not. And in fact, I think it was historically, in a sense, inevitable and fortuitous. Michael nicely historicizes the reasons for Catholic doubts about democracy in the late 19th century. The anti-clericalism of many European governments, at times, persecution of the Church. What he also needs to do, though, is historicize the reasons for the Catholic endorsement of democracy in the 1940s and 1930s, 40s, and 50s by Murray, Maritain, and others who, I think Michael is right, are the heroes in some ways, in my view, of this story. They endorsed it because of a kind of deep sadness over Catholic complicity with fascism in the 1930s, from Italy to Vichy France to Argentina. They endorsed it because of the trauma of World War II and the slaughter of armies on both sides, and then as word came out, the Holocaust. And so that led them to a vision of fundamental human rights that coincided in many ways with what American and European Democrats were talking about. I disagree with Michael that this vision was, in a sense, or this step of endorsement of democracy was an error, in part because of subsequent developments such as Roe versus Wade. I think it's a larger cultural problem than that. And here I agree with Professor MacIntyre that the engagement and constructive dialogue he calls for, in contrast with what he terms barren conversation, can only be facilitated by engagement with the society in which one lives. Finally, I'm not sure about Thomas Merton. I frankly confess, I think Michael's exactly right that I could have done more with Merton in the book and did do very little. I have to frankly confess I've often found Merton somewhat impenetrable. And when Michael said that he viewed Merton viewed Aquinas as a mystic, this only confirmed my initial presupposition. Now let me turn to Professor MacIntyre. Here too I'll begin with where we agree. First, a central, perhaps the central tension in Catholicism and American freedom is that of living as a Catholic Christian and living as an American. Embedded in this tension is exactly the prudential dilemma that Professor MacIntyre so eloquently describes. When do Catholic Christians speak as prophets, chastising the world around them? And when do they speak as concerned Catholic citizens in a social order for which they bear considerable responsibility? I am less concerned than Professor MacIntyre is that bishops and Catholics generally might become yet another interest group, a religious variant on the AARP or the Sierra Club. Precisely what will make bishops and Catholic intellectuals important voices in American society, and at times has made them important voices, is offering a coherent moral vision that encompasses a variety of discrete issues. Second, we agree that a certain amount of anti-Catholicism in any host society testifies to Catholic vitality, not Catholic obsolescence. If Catholics really believed that economic freedom did not entail the economic inequality that marks the United States of the 21st century, we would be noisier and less polite than we are. If we really believed that the family was the central unit of society, we would not encourage our students to so automatically value work and career over the competing claims of spouses, children, friendship, and neighborhood. The larger question here is one of formation in a distinct tradition, a topic for another day, but one crucial to the health of not just Notre Dame, but the larger Catholic community. Now where we may disagree. I am grateful for Professor MacIntyre's acute description of different notions of freedom. I wish in the book I could have contrasted as concisely as does Professor MacIntyre two views of individual autonomy. One that emphasizes the, quote, choices and preferences of individuals, and the Catholic view that the common good allows each individual to achieve his or her own particular good through social relationships. But had I tried simply to contrast two views of freedom, Catholic and liberal, I would have written a shorter book, and a less historically compelling one. Because any time two such powerful and comprehensive ideologies develop, internal arguments about the character of those ideologies and subsequent revisions become as important as more predictable clashes between proponents of one or another broad view. Professor MacIntyre knows this better than I do, and he refers to the importance of an ongoing argument in democratic society with many contestable claims on both sides about rights and goods. But neither he nor Father Baxter devotes much time to what historians might consider hard cases. So let's look at three hard cases. And I do this knowing in the audience that John Noonan, who's a particularly acute student of much of this material. Three hard cases. For example, a central claim in my discussion of the Catholic role in the 19th century debate over slavery is the following: that the vast majority of Catholics, certainly the vast majority of Orthodox Catholics, failed to see the moral case for immediate slave emancipation as late as the 1850s. Of course, neither did most white Northerners, but all other churches, including the Presbyterians, Baptists, and Methodists, had important abolitionist wings, and Catholics did not. And some Catholic theologians defended slavery very much in the abstract into the 20th century. At the same time, a liberal and at times liberal Catholic tradition, more forthright in its condemnation of slavery, had much to teach the Church at this particular 19th century moment. Or to phrase it more theologically, the religious roots of the Church's current condemnation of slavery lay for a time outside the formal teaching of the Church itself. A second example: Catholic ambivalence about political democracy, emerging from the anti-clericalism of some European countries in the late 19th century, and a more general view of society as hierarchical, is well known. Over time, and here the experience of Catholics in the United States, as Michael pointed out, was crucial, Catholic intellectuals, including Pope Pius XII, began arguing that the gospel and the Church required, almost, some form of democratic government. This shift in Catholic teaching grew organically out of the experience of the Church but also, as I've said, in tandem with a renewed focus around the world among Catholics and non-Catholics on the importance of democracy and individual human rights in the context of World War II and the Holocaust. Jacques Maritain, who spoke at Notre Dame so often in the 1940s and 1950s, was a leading figure here and a prime mover behind the 1948 United Nations Declaration on Fundamental Human Rights. A final example. I trace out in some detail, perhaps laborious detail, in Catholicism and American Freedom, the feverish lead up to Humanae Vitae in 1968. This debate was, as is always and unsurprisingly the case, both a political and a theological struggle. But the historical record suggests that most bishops at the council, including John Paul I, favored a change in the teaching on contraception, that most priests, certainly most priests in the United States active in the confessional, favored a change in the teaching, and that the vast majority of faithful married Catholic couples felt the need for a change even more strongly. John Courtney Murray, in the last talk given before he died in 1967, worried that in the case of contraception, the Church had spoken too soon, with a premature certainty. And in a letter written just before his death, Murray compared those defending the Church's position on contraception to those bishops who had opposed the Declaration of Religious Freedom at the Second Vatican Council. Now, none of this proves that Paul VI was misguided at Humanae Vitae. What it does suggest is that he stood quite ineffectively against powerful and I think genuinely moral currents, including, most importantly, a growing recognition of the importance of new roles for women and the changing nature of the family in a post-industrial economy. The problem here for Paul VI and Catholic bishops around the world was not, to use Professor MacIntyre's phrasing, that they were unelected. It was that they were unpersuasive. Bishops should be appointed and not elected in a hierarchical church, even if we could debate the mechanisms of that process. But bishops, like all of us, need to be alert to shifts in moral conventions that begin in unconventional places. Since 1968, I argue, the Catholic position on both contraception and women's ordination has muffled the effectiveness and vigor of Catholic arguments about abortion. Bishops talking about either gender or sex in a society that could well benefit from the wisdom of bishops on both subjects are no longer viewed as credible. I say all this quite clearly not to bog us down in debate over the morality of slavery, democracy, or contraception. My general point is this. In different ways, both Father Baxter and Professor MacIntyre posit an enduring argument between Catholics and liberals. I think this clash, this argument, is real. And Baxter and MacIntyre are both right to focus their attention on it. But Catholics have at times needed liberals, or at least liberal Catholics, to help the Church find its way. Just as now, I think, in a market-oriented society, in the market-oriented society in which we live, that society needs a powerful Catholic voice in defense of a moral law that we ourselves do not create. All of this requires a dedication to the constructive argument that Professor MacIntyre rightly hopes for. And if my book makes some contribution to that argument, I will be more than satisfied. But it challenges, I think, the idea current in some circles that the best church is one removed from the society it finds corrupt. Constant prophecy, after all, breeds its own complacency. And I will leave aside the difficulty of making an argument for disengagement at Notre Dame, an institution built upon the aspirations of Catholic parents that their children, our students, might flourish and shape a society and church they have come to love. Let's end by putting my concern in the form of a very long-winded question. Does the experience of Catholicism in the United States over the past 150 years demonstrate that effective Catholic teaching and witness in the society depends not only on having something to teach, but also on having something to learn? Thanks.
Are these things working? They are, aren't they? So we will sit here and take questions. I think that the two panelists might have other things to say to Professor McGreevy, but they'll have their chance. We'll start with you. Let me just begin, though, by saying that I think this is the very best panel I have ever sat on or heard. The content was absolutely marvelous, and I want a lot of appreciation from you people as well as questions. So, start in. Professor Sigmund.
I second that. Sorry. Sigmund, Princeton. I second that comment. I've been studying church and state and Christian democracy for 50 years, and this is the best discussion I've ever heard. And I wish it would be taped. I mean, the kind of basic fundamental issues that you discussed in each of your remarks, I think, are absolutely central to any thinking about this. But let me just sort of raise a question about so subjectivity and objectivity, the claims to truth. I see in the statement, each of the statements, a sort of notion that there is some kind of basic tension between Catholicism and liberalism, which relates to the Church's claim to truth about the common good, versus a view of human autonomy, which seems to challenge that claim to objective truth. And I wonder if you couldn't get a kind of intermediate position that Alasdair MacIntyre was sort of hinting at, which is that the Church has a claim to special insights, but doesn't have the claim to absolute truth on the application of those insights. That it believes in the existence of objective truth, but does not claim a monopoly on the application of it and even on development of its implications. And conversely, that liberalism needs a kind of natural law, natural rights, human rights, somehow kind of base foundation which goes beyond subjectivity. And then just to relate that to the American experience, I think in a way the problem of the tension between the United States, the Catholic community in the United States, I witnessed this sort of reconciliation in my scholarly career and writing about maritime Christian democracy all over the world. And there was this period, there was a brief shining moment, basically the Kennedy administration, the Second Vatican Council, when the two came together. They came apart over church-state issues and over Roe versus Wade. And they came apart, it seems to me, because of the Supreme Court. I wonder if the kind of dialogue, conversation that Alasdair MacIntyre talks about has a problem in American democracy, in that there are conversation stoppers, the Supreme Court being the conversation stopper on one side, and the Church's claim to absolute truth everywhere and always on the other side. And I wonder what you're saying, whether there is a solution, but or is this more a problem in the United States than it is in other contemporary societies? Is it a problem of a tension between a kind of relativist liberalism based on absolutism of the Supreme Court versus a claim to absolute truth and everywhere and always, or is it this more general problem that Alasdair raises of a conflict between religion and culture?
I think it's right that if you think about the relationship between Catholicism and politics as a problem in any host society in which Catholicism exists, that there are peculiar characteristics of the American situation, and one is certainly the Supreme Court. And I think those who have argued that Roe versus Wade was, whatever one thinks of the outcome of the decision, premature, that it cut off a longer discussion about human life that might have been more fruitful, as occurred in much of Europe, I think that's right. And that in some ways the tension is most acute in some ways in the United States because of the intensely individualist, rights-based legal culture that's developed, particularly over the last 30, 40 years. And figures like Mary Ann Glendon have written, I think, quite persuasively on that.
Alasdair?
One point about the Church, one on the Catholic community, one point about the United States. What I said about the virtue of prudence was, of course, said very briefly. The necessity of the virtue of prudence lies in this, that it is quite impossible to go either from the positive precepts of the natural law or from the teaching of the church on specific issues, to knowing what you have to do in concrete situations. That always has to be learned, how to apply these teachings. And in that learning is very often learning that has to draw upon the culture which you are confronting and which you inhabit, the secular culture. So I don't disagree with anything that Professor McGreevy said about Catholics having to learn from liberalism. We might disagree over particular issues as to what has to be learned, but that the interplay between Catholicism and the secular cultures with which it engages is one which the church has to learn. That's generally true. This is as true in China today, the church in China, as it is in the United States, with very different issues. So what I meant about, what I have said about prudence, ambiguity, tension, these are very importantly connected to how we learn. Secondly, I have a great advantage of not being an American. So I look at you on the outside, and I see people who, in relation to law, do three things. First, you exaggerate its importance. I mean, positive law. You love lawyers, or at least you finance them, which in America is often the same thing. But secondly, because you think law is so enormously important, you actually make it important, hence the importance of the Supreme Court. But thirdly, this is an exaggeration. There is a tremendous amount in American life that is independent of the way in which formal law proceeds. And if we were to look at the history of the abortion controversies and the pro-life movement, we have to reckon with the fact that although the pro-life movement has gained almost no legal victories, it has in fact had an enormous social impact on the lives of a myriad of young women, families, local communities, in ways that have nothing to do with positive law. And the prism, if you see everything through a legal prism, you don't understand America. And I think sometimes it's a good idea not to be an American. Unfortunately, most of you lack that opportunity.
I take it you're waiting in line? Come ahead.
I was struck by the comment toward the end about the need, I suppose, to exercise prudence in terms of, for example, the battle of fighting against abortion, in particular in deciding when and when not to talk about perhaps the even more divisive or more deeply divisive issues of contraception and women in the priesthood. And I definitely understand that, having been a student at Harvard for 4 years and a teaching assistant there for 2 years, and very active in the pro-life movement on campus, that it is important to know when and when not to push the issues further. But my concern maybe, and my question is, sort of wondering how far you meant to take that. And because I think that, for example, the issue of women in the priesthood perhaps is so deeply controversial and divisive because it gets to the heart of the controversy between the Catholic view of the person and the, in a sense, more limited liberal democratic view of the person, in the sense that the issue seems to me to be one as seeing the person either as defined by function, defining a person by what you can do, in which case it would make no sense to say that women couldn't be priests since they're perfectly capable of preaching or teaching or ministering. But if it's a matter of, if the heart of personhood is more a symbolic and sacramental thing in which the body has, as we heard in the talk of the Cardinal last night, that the body expresses, in a sense, a language, that it has this sacramental meaning, in which case it would make some sense to say that women can't be priests. And I think that divide may be a fundamental one between the Catholic view of the person and the view that's very common in our culture, and then we wouldn't want to paper over that too much. Perhaps we need to find more prudent ways, more sensitive ways to talk about it. But I was wondering if I could hear some comments.
I mean, I'll be very brief. I certainly don't want to get into an argument about women's ordination or contraception, both of which are complex theological issues, and well-meaning people are on both sides of those issues, smart, well-meaning people. However, what is striking to the humble historian, I guess when I say the word humble, you know I'm not really humble if I say it, but so just to the historian, is how closely linked the debate over contraception and the debate over abortion were in American history. And the fact that Catholic leaders were perceived as not credible on contraception, and then fairly quickly not credible on the position of women in leadership roles, which we might frame differently than women's ordination to the priesthood, has had a powerful effect on the ability of the Catholic pro-life message to be heard. And it was actually quite self-conscious within organizations like the National Organization of Women and the National Abortion Rights League to put to the forefront in the early 1970s in the state-by-state abortion debate Catholic women as a group that they could persuade and juxtapose those with male Catholic bishops as a way to symbolically say that the women's side of this issue is pro-choice. And in the internal correspondence of those groups, it's quite evident that was a conscious strategy. So my larger point is simply that, to echo Alasdair, at times the church has to learn from the culture around it, and it can learn very important and profound things.
Okay. Well, you're next, I believe.
Thanks. Edward Furton from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. My question is for Father Baxter, but I want to thank John McGreevy for his book and for his comments. And I was glad you disagreed with Father Baxter about the Christian and Catholic embrace of democracy. Father Baxter, you had a couple of asides and comments about the Democratic Republic, our form of government. And you indicated that you thought it was self-defeating for Christians to support it. And even at one point had said that Veritatis Splendor contains a comment from John Paul II saying that the United States is a tyranny. That's a quite astonishing claim. I expect you expected someone to bring that up, and you have comment on that. But certainly, I think what Paul Sigmund and others have said here about the Supreme Court is true. I personally would be prepared to say the court has acted in a tyrannical manner. Roe v. Wade, for example, was a decision of 9 members of our Supreme Judiciary, not of the American people. And as Dr. MacIntyre has already pointed out, that has caused a corruption of our culture. But you seem to be going much deeper than that. Certainly we all recognize our form of government has flaws. But the question I want to put to you is, what would you put in place of the Democratic Republic? I mean, we are political animals. We have to have a politics of some sort. You know, when Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, a woman asked him, what kind of government have you given us? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. I would think that the vast majority of Americans would want to keep this form of government. What would you put in its place?
My answer is not going to be satisfactory, because I don't necessarily think that the first agenda of Christians, of Catholics, when they're talking about political community, should be to come up with a conception of nation-state politics. I think that there are strands in the work of Yves Simon, for example, and some other apologists for Christian democracy, which indicate that a Christian conception of democracy requires the freedom of local communities to live according to the good life, and that when democracy reaches a certain proportion, it ceases to be genuine democracy but becomes something else. So that, for example, to speak of our democracy in terms of our ability to elect our leaders in the context of the way that political candidates are chosen every 4 years for president or for other high offices, I think that there's a very serious argument there that that's not democratic at all. That we really live in a very deeply bureaucratic culture where people feel very powerless, and that in that sense, the primary issue for us is to learn how to, I'm stealing all this from the guy to my left here, is to learn how to develop forms of community within which we will be able to live the good life. I think that those areas are becoming less possible. I think it's more difficult to do that now for a host of technological reasons. So the task for me I didn't say that it was wrong for Christians to deal with democracy. I said it's frustrated to attempt to come up with a Christian theoretical endorsement of the modern nation state.
I'm going to exercise the chair's privilege here and call on this tall gentleman who's been waiting so patiently to put the last question, because we're coming to the end of the time.
Paul Griffiths, University of Illinois. Thanks to the panel for a splendidly rich conversation. Like Professor MacIntyre, I maybe share the advantage of having grown up and been educated somewhere else. And that leads me to one puzzlement that I'll express briefly here, which is that Americans seem to find America much more interesting than it actually is. There's a seriousness behind that. There are endless discussions in all spheres of American public life, including American Catholic public life, about what to think about America. There are other topics, and perhaps more important ones. But that's a prelude to what I actually want to ask. I think that both Professor MacIntyre and Professor McGreevy exhibited a confidence in the significance of argued conversation that I'm not sure that I share. I think Professor MacIntyre is completely right that it requires the virtue of prudence to decide what to do in any particular setting. One of the exercises of prudence, perhaps, is to figure out the extent to which the culture in which we now live gives any importance at all to public argument about anything interesting. The extent to which, that's to say, public argument, whether offered by the US Catholic bishops or by intellectuals like those in this room, whether that has any purchase upon the main currents of cultural formation. I suspect increasingly that it does not. That Professor McGreevy's book, which is admirable and which I'm actually going to go and buy as soon as we're done here, that book is an example of a public intervention will have virtually no effect on public policy decisions, upon patterns of production and consumption, and on foreign policy decisions. Those decisions are made increasingly without respect to public argument. They're made as a result of pressures from elsewhere. If that's right, and I'd be interested to know if the panel thinks that it's right, if that's right, it probably suggests that we, meaning we intellectual representatives of Christianity in one way or another, ought to be doing less of that, less of offering public argument, and more of something else. The question is exactly what else, but I'd like to know whether that prudential assessment of the cultural inhospitability to public argument is shared or not, and what its significance is.
Fine.
Well, I don't know. I agree with that, Paul. I think that it is a matter of decision and discernment whether or not the task should be to try to inform public life. And of course, we can't withdraw from culture. That's kind of a misleading way to put it, but that we can devote ourselves to other tasks. And I think that we see some of this in the emphasis in the church these days on renewal, on catechesis, on formation, the themes of this conference in a way where, given the hostility, given the challenge of sending your kids to school and what they get taught, that you have to start thinking about, on local levels, different kinds of schools. I mean, that to me is, it does have public bearing, of course, and it has a public issue regarding charter and vouchers and so on. But it is a shift, and I think it's an appropriate one. And I think there's a host of analogous local issues that I think we're going to be turning to more and more in years to come.
I would agree with a good deal that Paul Griffiths says, but I think that the modifications you need to make to what he says are just of the first importance. So, on the one hand, I happen to believe that the only authentic politics of the common good is a local politics, and the situations in which public argument can indeed be rational and effective are characteristically local. But the moment you engage in that politics, in, for example, trying to create certain kinds of school in local areas, or in various other enterprises, you have to engage with the larger political system. And to do that, you have to understand it adequately and to give it its due. I find talk about the Supreme Court as a tyranny appallingly misleading. I mean, the sort of rhetoric we shouldn't allow ourselves ever. I don't actually much like the Supreme Court, but that's another matter. And it seems to me, what you need to do here are some very concrete studies. Take an issue with which I have been very engaged at times. Look at the way in which the Americans with Disabilities Act got passed. Look at the kind of politics that had to be mounted, the kind of coalitions that had to be built to get it passed in the form in which it has been passed. Look then at how its provisions, and it is a wonderful act, which I wholly support, how its provisions have been gradually eroded by courts, including the Supreme Court, in a variety of ways, and the politics necessary to try and stop that erosion. Now, this is something in which you can't fail to engage if you are concerned with the politics of disability in local contexts, and you can't have a real politics without that. So I don't see a stark alternative. I don't think we can turn our back on the larger issues. I think it's also very important to know when you stop arguing and start doing things other than arguing. I come from a society in which, whenever so often, we've stopped arguing and shot one another. And it hasn't always been a bad thing. But I don't think that's an option for Americans. Another reason why I would regret it if I were one.
John, the last word. Nothing more from John?
It's difficult to defend the importance of serious argument days before Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to elect governor of California. But so I think the question is a serious, perhaps profound one. I just don't know what else there is. I mean, this is the only way that we can work to try and affect change on the issues that we care about.
I remember reading once that David Reisman said he made arguments not to persuade others, but to encourage those who had already agreed with him. And at least we intellectuals interested in American Catholic history can take a great deal of encouragement from this morning's session. Thank you very much.